A river in Indiana just crested at its highest level in more than 100 years. 7 people are already dead, and meteorologists are warning that the same storm system responsible for all of it isn't finished yet. It's simply moving to its next target. Over the past week, central and eastern Indiana experienced what meteorologists officially classified as a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event, a statistical way of saying the odds of this much rain falling in this short a window under normal conditions are roughly 1 in 1,000 in any given year. Some locations recorded more than 11 inches of rain within just 48 hours, and storm totals in the hardest hit counties climbed close to 12 inches by the time the heaviest bands finally moved through. To put that in perspective, that's multiple months' worth of typical rainfall compressed into a single multi-day stretch. The disaster didn't arrive in isolation either. Just one day before the catastrophic rainfall began, a deadly derecho, a rare, unusually long-lasting, and destructive windstorm, tore through the same region, downing trees and power lines and setting the stage for what came next. When the torrential rain followed almost immediately afterward, it hit an already stressed landscape and an already strained emergency response system, compounding the damage in ways a single isolated storm typically wouldn't produce. The White River in Anderson, Indiana, became the epicenter of the crisis, cresting at more than 24 feet, the highest level recorded there in over a century. A crest that high sent water rushing several feet deep into residential and commercial areas across the city, forcing large-scale evacuations in Anderson and nearby Muncie. In Hamilton County, officials described the flooding as historic, and rescue crews across the region conducted dozens of water rescues within a single overnight period, pulling residents from homes, cars, and in at least one case, a person stranded on top of her own vehicle in floodwater. If you're finding this breakdown of what's actually driving this disaster helpful, go ahead and subscribe, because we track major weather emergencies like this one as they unfold, explaining not just what's happening, but why. Indiana Governor Mike Braun declared a statewide disaster emergency and mobilized the Indiana National Guard to support local response efforts, while more than 250,000 homes and businesses across the state lost power at the height of the storm. 7 deaths have now been confirmed across the affected region, including a 4-year-old child killed when a tree fell on a home during the initial derecho, underscoring just how this disaster compounded across multiple overlapping hazards, rather than presenting a single contained threat. Here's the part meteorologists want people to understand clearly, even as floodwaters in the hardest hit areas of Indiana began finally. Receding over the weekend, the underlying weather pattern driving this entire event hasn't actually moved on. It's expanding. The same complex of persistent, slow-moving thunderstorms responsible for Indiana's catastrophic rainfall has continued pushing eastward, bringing the same flood risk into Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. So why does a storm system like this keep regenerating instead of simply passing through and dissipating? The answer comes down to what meteorologists call training, a pattern where individual thunderstorm cells repeatedly form and move over the exact same geographic area, one after another, like train cars passing over the same section of track. Each new storm dumps its own load of rain directly on top of ground that's already saturated from the previous one, and because the storms keep regenerating in roughly the same location rather than spreading their rainfall out over a wider area, the cumulative totals can climb to genuinely historic levels within a remarkably short window of time. If this kind of real-time breakdown of what's actually happening in the atmosphere is useful to you, tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people trying to understand the weather disasters making headlines. That's precisely the mechanism now threatening the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians. The National Weather Service has already warned that rainfall across Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia could be persistent and widespread, potentially adding another 4 inches or more of rain on top of ground. That, in many of these areas, is already fully saturated from the same broader storm system that devastated Indiana. At the peak of this threat, more than 36 million people across the wider region found themselves under active flood alerts simultaneously, an enormous population footprint for a single connected weather event. Ohio has already begun experiencing the consequences of this eastward expansion firsthand. Heavy rains triggered flooding in communities, including New Lexington and hard-hit Perry County, where firefighters conducted more than 50 water rescues in a single overnight span, including pulling a stranded resident from atop her own car. Ohio. Governor Mike DeWine confirmed that roughly 375 residents were forced to flee their homes as floodwaters rose, and he was direct in warning that many of those residents may never be able to return to the homes they evacuated. This kind of geographic spread, a flood disaster expanding from one state into several neighboring ones over the course of just a few days, illustrates something important about how these extreme rainfall events actually behave. They aren't confined to a single county or even a single state, simply because that's where the worst initial damage occurred. The broader atmospheric pattern responsible for the disaster, in this case a persistent moisture-rich system parked over the Ohio Valley, continues, producing dangerous rainfall wherever it sits, regardless of state lines, until the pattern itself finally breaks down or shifts course entirely. Emergency management officials across the newly threatened states have been direct in their public messaging, urging residents living near rivers, creeks, and low-lying areas to prepare an evacuation plan in advance, rather than waiting until floodwaters are already at their doorstep. That guidance reflects a hard lesson from what just happened in Indiana, where the speed of the White River's rise caught even longtime residents off guard, with some describing floodwater levels inside their homes that they'd never experienced in decades of living along the same riverbank. There's also a broader climate dimension shaping why events like this seem to be striking with increasing frequency and intensity. Research has consistently shown that a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, meaning storm systems moving through an already warming climate have more water available to wring out as rainfall compared to similar storms decades ago. Investigative reporting has also found that many official flood risk maps used across the country were built primarily around coastal storm surge and large river flooding models, without fully accounting for the kind of intense, rapid rainfall and flash flooding events that climate change appears to be making both more common and more severe, meaning some communities may not fully realize their flood risk until an event like this one actually arrives. For residents across Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia currently watching this system move into their region, the practical guidance echoes what emergency officials in Indiana wished more people had acted on sooner. Monitor local river gauge, forecast closely. Take any flash flood warning seriously regardless of how the sky looks at that specific moment. And if you live near rising water, make your evacuation plan now while you can still safely get out of your neighborhood, rather than waiting for water to already be at your door. As this storm system continues its slow march eastward, meteorologists will keep tracking exactly where the heaviest training thunderstorms set up next, since that specific location, more than the storm's overall size or duration, will ultimately determine which communities face the most severe flooding in the days directly ahead. Indiana's catastrophic week offered a preview of exactly what this pattern is capable of producing. Whether Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia experience something similar now depends entirely on where those storm cells decide to park next. Let's dig a little deeper into how forecasters actually distinguish a routine heavy rain event from something with the potential to become a genuine catastrophe, because the tools behind that distinction are worth understanding. The National Weather Service uses a tiered excessive rainfall outlook system, ranking flood risk on a scale from marginal up through a level 4 high risk, reserved for the rarest and most dangerous setups. During the height of this event, forecasters issued a level 3 of 4 risk across parts of Indiana, southwest Ohio, and north central Kentucky, a designation that, while technically one step below the maximum, still corresponds to a disproportionately large share of the year's most damaging flash flood disasters whenever it's issued. That risk rating exists because not all heavy rain produces equally severe flooding. The same rainfall total falling over a wide, well-drained rural landscape might cause only modest, manageable runoff, while an identical amount concentrated over a smaller urban watershed or funneled into a narrow river valley like the one surrounding Anderson, Indiana, can produce catastrophic, life-threatening flooding within just a few hours. Forecasters combine rainfall intensity predictions with detailed knowledge of local terrain, soil saturation, and river basin geometry to identify exactly which specific communities face the highest risk from a given storm system, rather than issuing a single blanket warning across an entire region. River gauges play an equally critical role in this entire warning system, and understanding how they work helps explain why officials could forecast the White River's historic crest in Anderson with real precision, even before it happened. A network of automated sensors positioned along rivers and streams continuously measures water level and, in many cases, water flow rate, transmitting that data in near real time to hydrologists who combine it with rainfall forecasts to predict how high a given river is likely to rise and roughly when it will reach its peak. That's precisely how officials were able to warn residents in Anderson and Muncie about a coming crest above 24 feet with enough lead time to organize evacuations before the worst of the flooding actually arrived. It's also worth understanding why derechos like the one that struck just before this flooding often get treated as a distinct, serious hazard in their own right, rather than simply a footnote to the rain that follows. A derecho is defined by widespread, long-lived, and unusually intense straight-line wind damage, stretching across a large geographic swath, often accompanying a fast-moving line of severe thunderstorms. These wind events can topple trees onto homes and vehicles, snap power lines across huge areas, and, as tragically happened in this case, cause fatalities entirely independent of any flooding that follows. When a derecho strikes an area shortly before a major flood event, as it did here, it leaves behind downed trees and debris that can worsen drainage problems and complicate emergency response, layering one disaster's consequences directly on top of the next. For the communities across Indiana now beginning the long process of recovery, cleaning out flooded homes, assessing structural damage, and in some tragic cases, mourning lost loved ones, the practical work ahead extends well beyond simply waiting for floodwaters to fully recede. Federal disaster assistance requests, insurance claims, and infrastructure repairs typically stretch on for months after an event of this scale, even once the storm system itself has moved on to threaten entirely different states. That long recovery timeline is part of why officials continue urging affected residents to document damage thoroughly and connect with emergency management resources as early as possible, since the visible floodwater retreating from a street is often only the first, most immediate phase of a much longer recovery process still to come. For now, forecasters expect the heaviest rain threat to gradually ease across the hardest hit stretch of the Ohio Valley by the end of the week, even as isolated pockets of the upper Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes region continue seeing additional downpours through the weekend. Until that broader pattern finally breaks down completely, emergency management agencies across multiple states remain on high alert, watching the same river gauges, rainfall forecasts, and soil saturation data that gave Indiana just enough warning to save lives, even as the storm ultimately overwhelmed the state's rivers in ways few residents had ever witnessed before. That's really the through line connecting every part of this disaster, from the derecho that struck first, to the historic rainfall that followed, to the flood risk now spreading into 3 more states. A single, persistent weather pattern, not a series of unrelated coincidences, has been driving all of it, and understanding that connection is exactly what allows forecasters, emergency managers, and residents alike to anticipate where the next chapter of this story is most likely to unfold next.